This video is being recorded 2 weeks after using the Nikon Z8. It's a follow-up to my video from last week concerning my first week shooting with the Nikon Z8. Now, in that first week, I shot almost 6,000 pictures. I didn't shoot nearly as much this past week, only about, well, it was probably just under 1,000. So what I want to do is clarify a few things from that first video. I want to talk about some of the things I've learned since that time, answer a few questions that some viewers had, and also talk about something that I read a few days ago concerning noise with the Z8. So let's get started. First thing I'm going to talk about is this noise issue. I believe it was something I read where someone said the noise, the high ISO noise on the Z8 wasn't very good, and they compared it to a Nikon D6. Now the Z8 is a 45 megapixel camera, while the D6 is a 20 megapixel camera, both full frame. The photo sites on the D6 are larger than those on the 45 megapixel Z8, and it's going to have better high ISO noise. In fact, I've owned the Z7 and Z6 for several years and ran some tests, and the Z6, which is a 24 megapixel camera, has better high ISO noise than the Nikon Z7, which, like the Z8, is a 45 megapixel camera. So that's just the way it is. The more megapixels, the more noise. Now, I think the Z8 does a great job with high ISO noise. I've shot it as high as 12,800, and it is noisy, more noisy than the Z6, but it's fixable. I wouldn't want to always shoot at 12,800 with the Z8. I prefer to stay at 6,400 and lower, but it can be used if you absolutely need to. But a lower megapixel count full frame camera is usually going to have better high ISO noise than a higher megapixel camera. That's just a fact of life. Now, in last week's video, I showed a lot of pictures that were shot at the Edwin Forsyth Wildlife Refuge in New Jersey, and I shot at 20 frames a second raw. I ended up with over 4,100 pictures. This week, I went to South Philadelphia, to FDR Park, where there are some lakes and there are some birds and ducks. I didn't get any birds in flight, but I did shoot some robins, a few other birds, some ducks, and I scaled back to 15 frames a second raw. I wanted to shoot in DX mode. I forgot to do that. So what I did last couple days, I shot a few things at home. I have a bird feeder set up behind my deck on my house, and got a little bit there using DX. So we'll look at some of those pictures. We'll also look at some of those pictures from FDR. I had a few questions. Someone asked me about adapted lenses. So previous to obtaining the Z8, I had been working on a video on Canon's 55mm 1.2 FL lens, a lens that dates back to the 60s. And I was using it adapted on my Z6 and Z7, and I planned on doing a video on that. Well, the Z8 came in, and I got kind of sidetracked with the Z8, understandably. So I mounted that lens on the Z8 and just shot a few things. So we're going to look at a few of those pictures. And then I also mounted my 45mm 1.8 Tamron with built-in image stabilization with the F to Z adapter on the Z8, and just shot a few pictures of the cat around the house. Let me just say that the adapted lenses work great, both the Tamron. I figured if the Tamron would work good, I'm sure the other Nikon F-mount lenses would as well. And the Tamron worked perfectly. Autofocus was great, exposure was great, everything about it worked fine. And as far as the Canon lens, and again, we're going to see some pictures from that lens, that worked well, good as well. Focus peaking worked great. I have read, and now I've seen for myself, focus peaking seems to work better with the Z8. Now, one thing I did notice when going back over the photos from last week at the Wildlife Refuge and this week at FDR Park and in my backyard was that the first frame of a burst of either 20 frames a second as I was shooting last week or 15 frames a second that I was shooting this week, that first frame was not as sharp as the second, third, and additional frames. So it seems like it's taking the camera like a split second to achieve focus, to lock in that focus. Now we're talking here at 20 frames a second, we're talking from frame 1 to frame 2, we're talking a 20th of a second, and at 15 frames a second, we're talking a 15th of a second. So it's a small thing, but I did notice that, again, not in every case, but I did notice that sometimes. Otherwise, the focus was excellent. Usually found the eye. You're going to see some pictures where there's some foliage in front, and the camera just went to the bird's head and to the eye. Now, I had a question concerning memory banks from one of the viewers. Last week in my video, I mentioned that the Z8 has 4 memory banks, like the Z9. And I have my memory banks set for portrait, studio portrait actually, events, action, and just general photography. And that's basically all I said about that. So now I'm going to show you how to set them up and also extended memory banks. And we're going to take a look at that now. Okay, so let me explain how to set up the shooting memory bank. All right, there are 4, A, B, C, and D. When you first turn on the camera, if you've not done this before, it's just going to show A, B, C, and D, and you want to name them. All right, I have it set up so that memory bank A is for portrait, B, studio portraits, B is for events, C is for action, and D is just for general photography. So let me just show you how to change that. Okay, so we just moved over once with the pad here. It says rename, we go over again, and then we could input whatever we want to call it. All right, and to do that, you're just going to navigate each letter, hit OK, and we go back. All right, so do the same for the other 4 banks. You don't have to use all the banks, you use what you want. All right, so how does this work? All right, so for portraits, okay, now I am in memory bank A, okay? You can see it highlighted here, shoot A. It doesn't display that it's portrait there, but if you press the OK button, you'll see that it's portrait. Okay, so let's go across the top here. I have it set for picture control for portrait, right? I have white balance set for pre-white balance, so it's custom white balance. I'll take a reading off of a gray card. I have it set for RAW plus JPEG. Matrix metering doesn't really come into play because I am using Flash, Studio Flash. Let's see. Well, it shows manual focus because I don't have a lens on the camera, but that would show the focus mode I was in, which is subject detection. It shows I'm in FX, full frame. If it was DX, it would display a DX there. Okay, my vibration reduction is off because I'm on a tripod. Again, that's shoot A. And there's really focus peaking I have on in case I decide to manual focus. All right, so settings like that are stored in the memory bank. Okay, in this case, in memory bank A for portraits. The thing that is not stored is the frame advance. Now I will be set for this for single frame, for portraits for single frame advance. If I was in my action memory bank, it would be set for continuous high, let's say 20, 15 or 20 frames a second, whatever. So if I went from memory bank C, which is the action, to memory bank A, I would have to change it to single advance. It doesn't remember that. Now, there's one other thing you need to know. Extended memory banks. It's either off or on. Extended memory banks retain 3 additional pieces of information. Your shutter speed, and that would be for shutter priority or manual exposure mode. Your aperture for aperture priority or manual exposure mode, and your exposure mode, whether it's manual, shutter priority, aperture priority, or program. That's what the extended memory banks do. Okay, so I hope I made that clear. If you have any questions on that, please drop me an email or leave a comment in the comments below. Now, there's another thing about the memory that isn't so great. And let me just get back to that. Okay, so we're in portrait, right? Now, let's say I decide for some reason to use a different ISO. Let's say I would go, normally I'm in ISO of 64. Let's say I'm photographing a large group with my studio lights. I need to increase my ISO to maintain the same aperture. Okay, so I got to bring my lights back. And I have to change my ISO to, let's say, 200. So I change the ISO to 200, I shoot the job, turn off the camera. Now when I come back to that camera the next day, let's say, to do some headshots where I'm normally set to ISO 64, that memory bank is going to have remembered that the last thing that was set into it was ISO 200. So any changes you make to a memory bank stay with that memory bank. It would be nice if it just remembered those initial settings when you come back to the camera the next day, and you can start from there. So in other words, that ISO would be at 64, but it's not. Whatever the last setting in that memory bank was made while you were shooting, that is what is retained in the memory bank. I know that may be a little confusing, but just remember, if you change your ISO or you change any of those other settings that are in the memory bank, that they are going to stay there until you change them back to what they were originally. Now, we're going to look at some pictures in a few seconds here, but just one clarification. I've been referring in this previous section to memory banks. Actually, Nikon refers to them as menu banks. I think memory banks is a better description, but Nikon calls them menu banks. Okay, so starting out here, we're going to look at some pictures shot with the adapted Canon 55mm 1.2 at 1.2, and I love 1.2 lenses. Actually, this is the only one I own, but I am doing a video on 1.2 lenses, which will be coming out, I'm not sure when, in a few weeks, I suppose, but the adapted lens worked fine. Focus peaking worked great. And of course, you also have that magnified view for manual focus lenses. Next, I have a few shots here of one of our cats shot with the 45mm Tamron 1.8. And the nice thing with these vertical shots with the Z8, you can turn the rear LCD to shoot verticals. I was holding the camera at a low angle. This is also with the rear LCD, but used horizontally. So it's really adaptable and makes for real easy low angle shots. Okay, so now we go to FDR Park, and this is an uncropped shot at 15 frames a second. As I said, I was shooting there at 15 frames a second. I learned my lesson, 20 frames a second. Gives you a lot of images. This is a crop version of that first photo you saw, a few frames later, just to give you an idea. The focus was great. Starting at a distance, it focused right in on the bird. Here's another one of a robin. This was cropped a good bit. ISO for these was 2800, 3200. So, the noise, as I spoke earlier about noise, and a lot depends on how much you crop. And those images you're looking at, were shot at 3200, 2800, and they were cropped, but you really don't see that much noise. Now, if you're going to shoot at 12,800 and crop heavily, noise is going to increase. Now, the camera was not fooled by these branches, by the bright light coming from behind, and it focused really accurately on the robin. Now, these shots here were shot, you're going to see several shots of some ducks, were shot at 8,000 ISO. This one was not cropped. The previous one was cropped a little bit. I think I just applied very little noise reduction in Lightroom. And here's another shot. And I was using what I used last week, the 70-200 with the 2-time teleconverter, giving me the equivalent of a 400 millimeter 5.6. Now, in most cases with small birds, using this 70-200 with the 2-time converter, I still had to crop a good bit to give me a decent size image of the bird. Now, this is a full frame shot, and this one here is cropped a good bit. So I think it would be best to have a longer lens, maybe the 400-4.5 with the 1.4 converter to give you an equivalent 560 millimeter, or perhaps the 200-600 when it comes out, if it comes out, would get you closer. But so with small birds, 70-200 with the 2X is nice, but I'd like something longer. Now, these shots here, you're going to see some ducks. They're a lot larger bird, and I was able to get close. They seemed to be not afraid of people as much as the smaller birds. And so using the 400, the equivalent 400 for these guys seemed to work out pretty well, especially when they were on land. Once they got in the water, obviously they got further away from me, and I could have used something longer. But if you're shooting at a lower ISOs, you can crop considerably without an increase in grain. But if you do need to get into those high ISOs, I think it would be better to have a longer lens. Now, in this shot here, the focus was on the bird on the left. I was shooting at f8, but it wasn't quite enough depth of field to get the bird on the right as sharp as it could have been. But the focus was right on the eye in every case here on the one that I chose to focus on. And I was very pleased with the quality of these images. Color saturation, exposure, everything was right on the money. Now, I was using auto ISO, so ISO jumped all over the place. And real quickly, let me just explain that. Basically, the camera is set for manual mode. So you select shutter speed you want to use, you select an aperture, and you have the camera set for auto ISO. And what will happen, it really works like an auto exposure mode, but instead of varying either the aperture or shutter speed, the camera will vary the ISO. You can still dial in exposure compensation. For example, if it's a bird in flight against the light colored sky, you're going to dial in some plus exposure compensation. And the way the exposure compensation works, again, it works with ISO. Now, last week I was shooting using back button focus because that's what I used to do when I had the Nikon D500. But because of the great eye focus with this camera, I decided to just go with shutter button focus. And I reprogrammed the AF on button for 3D tracking. So once I achieved focus on the bird's head, I just pressed in the AF on button, which is now 3D tracking button, and it followed the bird around. I could change my composition, but it kept accurate focus on the head of the bird. So that worked out really good, and I think I like that better than using the AF on button as originally intended for AF on. Now this group of ducks here, I was at 8,000 ISO. They were under a tree in the water. Light wasn't that great. My aperture was 6.3. I wish I had used a smaller aperture to keep more of them in focus, but just look, there is very little noise here. There was some noise reduction applied in Lightroom, but not very much. Now this guy here went out into the water. He got into a little bit better light, and the camera selected an ISO of 5,000. But look at the sharpness, the focus right on his eye. This one here was a little more light with his reflection, and that was at 3,200. Okay, so now I come back home, and these are some shots. In my backyard, I have a bird feeder set up right off my deck, but of course a squirrel always seems to show up to try to steal the bird's food. And this was from my back door, my sliding door. It's about 15 feet from where I was to the squirrel. And again, focus was right on the eye, except for animal focus. I had the camera on a monopod. When I shoot this way, I usually have a monopod. And ISO here was, the light was good. It was like 400. And in the future, I'm going to do a video describing my setup and how it works. This guy came down a piece of the lawn of the deck furniture and was trying to get to the flowers. My wife was not too happy because these squirrels seemed to be getting into the flowers and digging them out. So, but I'm really pleased with these images. Now, I shot up into the tree there. There was this robin, and I still forgot to set the camera for DX. There's so many settings on this camera. I just forgot to do it, and this is cropped in, but the quality's, not bad. ISO was 1400 at this point. Here's another shot. I believe the aperture was 7.1. And then I finally remembered to set DX mode. So this is in DX mode of this small bird at the top of this arborvitae. And this is the crop version. So DX mode does help. It brings the image up bigger in the camera. And if you're going to crop anyway, shooting full frame mode, why not shoot DX? And this one isn't too bad at a cropped DX image, and you still retain a lot of quality. Now this was a cardinal who was on the bird feeder. I had mounted the bird feeder too low, so he's on the bird feeder, and I got to bring that bird feeder up higher. But anyway, so then this is in DX mode, and I cropped this quite a bit to get him as tight as he is, and you could see the quality is still pretty darn good at an ISO of 900. Okay, so I hope this video cleared some things up from my previous video on the Z8. And I'll be doing additional videos in the coming weeks on the Nikon Z8. There's a lot to learn about this camera. I've been using Nikon digital cameras since the D1 came out. So I have a lot of experience with Nikon cameras, but this one is different. This one has a lot more programmable buttons. There's a lot it can do. I'm really enjoying it, but there's a lot to learn. Also, if there's any questions you have concerning the Z8, anything you would like me to cover, please leave it in the comments below. I will answer your question, but I will also try to do a video if it's warranted. So thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. I come out with a new video every Wednesday morning at 11 a.m. Now, I know I've said I was going to try to be doing maybe 2 videos a week now. I haven't been able to get to that, but I will try, and I will also have that video on the Canon 55 1.2 coming soon. So again, thanks for watching, and I will talk to you soon.